case to be made for it. But I do think also that in this context, in the context of modern methods of war fighting and the inevitability of civilian casualties, I think that the idea of double effect, or the idea of collateral damage, is an evasion of responsibility. If the bombing of populated areas and the resultant civilian deaths, if these are an integral part of the way in which the war is fought, then even though it may not be the deliberate intention to kill civilians, nevertheless, if that strategy is an integral part of the way in which the war is fought, then you can't say that civilian casualties are a mere side effect. You can't just say that they are collateral damage. It seems to me they make the war itself unjust. So having tried to give it a run for its money then, I want to conclude that, in fact, the just war approach can never show that a modern war, at any rate, can be a just war. I've suggested that it's a serious attempt to deal with a serious fundamental ethical dilemma, but in the end, I think it fails. And it fails because it fails to give sufficient weight to the human cost of war. You remember our fundamental question, the question we started with, was why is killing soldiers in war an exception to the deep moral wrongness of killing other human beings? And in the end, the answer of just war theory turns out to be because they're soldiers, because they're combatants, and therefore not innocent. And that way of thinking, I think in the end, simply puts too much moral weight on ideas of innocence and individual responsibility and the loss of innocence on the part of soldiers. In the literature of war, in novels and poems, you time and again come across this typical incident that a soldier kills his enemy and he then recognizes that the person that he killed was not merely an enemy soldier, but a fellow human being. Perhaps he looks at the dead man's papers, looks at photographs of his wife and children, and he recognizes that the person that he's killed was someone with his own irreplaceable human life, a life that is gone forever. And that's what I mean by the human cost of war and the way in which simply distinguishing between combatants as legitimate targets and non-combatants as not targets fails to do justice to that fundamental human cost of war. And I've also argued then that in any case, modern wars are not only the killing of soldiers. Modern wars cannot be just because the killing of innocent civilians is an inescapable part of the way in which modern wars are fought. And so that too is part of the unacceptable human cost of war. So I want to suggest then that a humanist approach to the ethics of war needs to start out from the recognition that if war and killing in war never can be just, then we have to think about how to prevent war, how to make wars less likely. We can't just ask in particular cases, is there a justification for going to war or not? We have to think about how to try to prevent war altogether. And even if we cannot abolish war in the foreseeable future, we have to consider how the resort to war can be avoided. And that thinking needs to be rooted not in abstract ideas of innocence, not in arguments about whether combatants and non-combatants are or are not innocent, but in the real world and in the political institutions of the real world. Now, those questions, of course, about how war and conflict can be prevented, how wars can be made less likely, those, of course, are a central theme of this conference, and this Congress. And the discussions of questions of conflict prevention and conflict resolutions that are already in previous sessions, and I'm sure we'll be returning to them in future sessions as well. So that's an important part then of the humanist approach to war, and that's built into a lot of what we're doing in this conference. But it still leaves the question, what are we to do in particular cases if, say, our own government is contemplating going to war? Should we support it or oppose it? When, if ever, is it right for governments to go to war? And when, if ever, is it right for us to support decisions of that kind? That's the question that faced many of us, for example, during those months when the United States and the United Kingdom and other countries were contemplating going to war against Iraq, and millions of us marched in opposition to that. And there's no way of evading those questions in particular cases, however important the long-term considerations, the long-term policies for conflict prevention and conflict resolution may be. There still remain those tough questions in the particular cases. Is it right to go to war or not? And should we support the decisions of our governments to go to war? Now, when thinking about those questions, then again, we might want to take the position of absolute pacifism. And I would imagine there are people here who would want to take that position. But what I want to propose now is that, in fact, there's a good case for retaining in practice the two key principles of just war theory, but putting them on a different foundation. I want to suggest that there's a good case for retaining the idea that the only acceptable reason for war is defense against aggression, and for retaining the idea that civilian populations should never be targeted in war. Retaining them not on the basis of just war theory and its appeal to the analogy with individual self-defense, but retaining them for the practical reason that they are enshrined in the United Nations Charter and in international law. You see here how Article 2, Part 4 of the United Nations Charter prohibits wars of aggression, and Article 51 then goes on to recognise countries' right of self-defence. So that's deeply enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Similarly, the idea of non-combatant immunity is enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the 1977 additional protocols. You can see there, the Geneva Conventions recognise the right of immunity for the civilian population. The civilian population shall enjoy general protection against military operations. They must not be the object of attack. So, I'm making the case then for retaining the importance of those two principles, the principle of non-aggression and the principle of non-combatant immunity. But why should we give any weight to these rules? Is it enough just to say, well, that they're part of the UN Charter and part of international law? If they are historically derived from the just war tradition, and if just war theory fails to provide adequate moral foundations for them, then why retain them? Well, what I'm suggesting is that the reasons for upholding them, the reasons for retaining them, are pragmatic reasons, namely that doing so makes war less likely. If every country accepted the rule that aggression is prohibited, if every country accepted the rule that the only acceptable wars are wars of defence, then of course it would follow, if every country accepted it, that there would be no wars. If every country is committed to the principle that the only good reason for going to war is self-defence, then of course wars will never start. But if all countries are committed to never starting wars, then it follows logically wars would never start. Now obviously that goal is not yet in sight, and there are big ifs there, but the fact remains, I think, that the United Nations Charter and what it says about aggression and self-defence is the right starting point for an international order that offers at least some hope of a peaceful world. Likewise, if the Geneva Conventions upholding non-combatant immunity and the protection of the civilian population, if they're effectively upheld, then that would make it more difficult to fight wars, and it would make wars less destructive. Again, those are good pragmatic reasons for upholding that principle. Now, I emphasize again that these are pragmatic reasons. They make war less likely. They don't make a war fought in accordance with those principles a just war. And I do want to suggest in the end, in response to the just war tradition, that the language of justice is the wrong language. No war is a just war. Every war is a moral tragedy. Now, I want finally to say something about a very difficult contemporary area of thinking about the ethics of war, which is the issue of humanitarian military intervention. With some people, particularly recently, have wanted to argue that this should be allowed under international law. The idea here is that if a country's government is oppressing or failing to protect its own people, then other countries may be entitled to intervene to protect the human rights of that country. Attention was focused on this idea of humanitarian military intervention after the failure of the international community to prevent genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And again, after the failure to prevent so-called ethnic cleansing and the massacres in Yugoslavia, and especially in Bosnia, in 1995 and before and after. And that gave rise to a lot of heart searching and led to a lot of people saying this must never happen again. And that led, in due course, to the formulation at the United Nations of the principle of responsibility to protect, a principle that was agreed at the United Nations World Summit in 2005, and you can see there the way in which it was formulated in paragraph 138 of what was agreed at that summit in 2005. It specifies particular crimes that governments may commit, again, which governments sometimes commit against their own civilian population: crimes of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And paragraph 138 says that every government has the responsibility to protect its own population against these crimes, and then goes on in 139 to say that if a government fails to protect its own population, then the international community has a responsibility to protect them. And paragraph 139 continues with at least the implication that if peaceful means are inadequate, then military action may be necessary. It doesn't actually use the phrase, you notice, military action, but what it says is that we, the states of the United Nations, are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities fail to protect their populations. Clearly, a war fought on the basis of responsibility to protect, which was a war of intervention in another country, would not be a war in defense of a country's territorial integrity. It would be, on the contrary, an invasion of territorial integrity. Some think that the doctrine of responsibility to protect can be used to justify the current military action in Libya, which we've already referred to, and which is obviously a very pressing question. So what are we to say about that idea? The idea of a responsibility to protect, and the more general idea of